Well, welcome to all of you who have joined us for the second event of the International Environment Forum's 28th Annual Conference. We're a Baha'i-inspired organization for environment and sustainability. The overall theme of this conference is a world-embracing vision for a sustainable future. It consists of 4 virtual events. One has already taken place on the 14th, a vision of individual conference with youth, and we'll shortly be posting on our website the recording of that session and a summary of the very interesting concepts the youth shared with us, their visions of the future. Here we are looking at developing a vision for global collaboration, which is looking at some of the challenges of global governance. Then on the 22nd of September, we have a third event, Building Futures in Communities, for local community perspectives on the future. And then after the Summit of the Future on the 28th of September, our last event, Where Do We Go From Here? Deeds, Not Words. The conference is associated with and in support of the UN Summit of the Future in New York, where it has its action days on the 20th and 21st of September, and the Intergovernmental Summit on the 22nd, 23rd of September to adopt a Pact for the Future and other declarations. The Summit of the Future is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reconsider what is wrong with global governance and what changes are required to address the urgent needs of today. The Pact of the Future includes 60 actions under 5 themes. The first, sustainable development and financing for development. The second, international peace and security. The third, science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation. The fourth, youth and the future generations, which we addressed in our first event. And then the fifth, transforming global governance, which is the topic of this event this evening, or today. Our last conference will review the results of the summit and discuss ways forward, both for the International Environment Forum and more broadly. We're partnering also with some other side events taking place in New York, including the launch of a second charter modernizing the UN for future generation on the 19th of September, what is global governance next, and the road to the Summit of the Future, generating impact from the Pact for the Future, and a third event by the Baha'i community, Room for Optimism, all on 21st of September. We hope that you will find your participation in our IEF conference enlightening and useful. We shall make a report of the conference available on our website after the conference, where you can also find the reports of all our previous conferences and many other useful resources. If you like our work and share our values, you may want to consider joining the International Environment Forum. Now I'll turn over to our moderator for this event, Wendy Moman, who has so many qualifications, it's hard to describe what she's been doing for many generations. Wonderful person to work with, and she'll be able to lead us through the discussion with our exciting panelists this evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Arthur. It's wonderful to be here with so many people. I see there's quite a number of participants on this webinar. And just to pay tribute to Arthur Dahl himself, who's known since my childhood, is absolutely one of the most outstanding people in the world. Somebody says he can't hear anything. I don't know if that's true for others. Can someone else put in the chat if that's the case?
We can hear you.
Audio is fine, it says. So it may be, David, your own situation. Thanks so much, everybody, for responding to that. And so, as Arthur said, welcome to this second of sessions of the International Environment Forum's seminars on this important topic. Today's particular topic is developing a vision for global collaboration, something we sorely need in the world today. We have 3 amazing speakers, and you'll also see 2 other screens here. One is Christy Muller, who's the Secretary of the International Environment Forum, and Laurent Mesbah, who's the assistant today to me. We'll be looking at your questions and comments that are in the chat a little bit later on, also a member of the Board of International Environment Forum. I just wanted to say that we're treating this like a conversation, and it's kind of difficult when you're having a conversation, you can't see anyone. So although it's a webinar, we decided we show our faces. It's quite difficult to talk to yourself when you're on a webinar. So we thought we'd have our own faces at least, but we also wanted to extend the conversation to everyone later on in the program. So what we thought we would do is to use the chat. We won't use question and answers because that's rather a formal process on Zoom. So we thought of this being a friendly space where people can greet each other, comment on the topics discussed on the webinar, uh, and ask questions of the speakers and provide some factual information or useful information if they've got that for the other participants. And it really enables everybody to actively participate in the conversation that's taking place on Zoom. There are some sort of comments that we'd like to make about trying to keep the integrity of this space. So please do be considerate of others by bearing in mind these few points. The Zoom webinar is for everyone, so please keep your chats short and to the point. Lengthy pieces can be quite distracting and make it difficult for people to concentrate on the webinar itself. Please post only as needed so that the comments of others are not lost among the postings. Lots of hellos and things can be quite distracting for many people as well. And so it's also hard for myself and also for Laurent to search out the questions that are to come to the panel later on. And then also, we want to make sure that we're very courteous to each other. I'm speaking to the converted here, so it's just a list of things that we thought about for conversation. We're trying to learn about the topics that are being discussed today, and people will hold different views on these topics from one another. And it's very useful to have different perspectives, but as long as they're presented with courtesy in this space. And do think about others before posting on chat. Use moderate language to express your views and to make your comments and to raise your questions. And for those who are unable to observe these points, the decision might have to be taken. I'm sure it will not be used to exclude a person from the webinar because this is a social space for all of us. So thank you for your consideration of others, and I will now introduce the first speaker of our panel, who is Soveida Mani Ewing. You might know her as a very prolific author, speaker, and host of a popular podcast called Reimagining Our World. She's also founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, which is an online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to global challenges. So please, Soveida, you have about 15 minutes.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I'm going to share a brief PowerPoint presentation. So just give me a second here. All right. I'd like to start by framing this conversation that we're going to have by looking at a three-step process that I tend to use in my own work. I find it very helpful. The three steps are: where are we now? Accepting responsibility for the reality we've created, creating a vision of the future we want and deserve, and then identifying the steps that we need to take to bridge the gap between here and there. Let's start with where we are now. The truth is that our world has become interconnected and interdependent as never before. We've essentially become the world's contracted into what is a single organism. While there are many benefits to it, the truth is that the single organism, think of a human body, has also made us prone to systemic risks. It's like when you think of the human body, it's like the body being prone to cancer or autoimmune diseases that run all through into the body. There's actually another analogy that I'd love to use here. It's not mine, it's that of a Singaporean diplomat, erstwhile diplomat and famous academic. He said that whereas before humanity had been like 193 boats bobbing on the sea of international life, it has now become a ship consisting of 193 cabins. Yet, unfortunately, while each of the cabins is well regulated, the ship as the whole lacks a captain and crew. So when the gale force winds come and the storms come, this ship of humanity is likely to sink. And we just need to stop for a moment to consider two of our existential threats today: climate change and the threat of nuclear war, which is at its highest since the early 60s when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's clear that global dangers demand global solutions, and yet we're lacking the very collective decision-making and enforcement institutions necessary to tackle them. So our system of global governance is extremely primitive, and this is what we're here to talk about. So where do we need to be? This is the future. In the 1970s, the famous historian Arnold Toynbee made a striking comment. He said that humanity would be faced with two stark choices: political unification or mass suicide. He observed that we have a habit, a knee-jerk habit, of rejecting any calls for global governance. But he predicted that as soon as we were faced with an existential threat of our own making, we would kick this habit and we would turn on a dime, albeit kicking and screaming, to form some form of limited government. So I want us to focus first on that term, limited global government. He said we would do this voluntarily because we lived in a time when it was no longer tenable to unify through the use of force. For one reason, because we have an atom bomb. So you can't force people who have atom bombs to do what they don't want to do. And secondly, because history had demonstrated that trying to unify by force is futile because it leads to strong resistance, if not in the short term, in the long term, and to a resurgent nationalism. And we have plenty of evidence of this in the world. He said to succeed, we would need to develop an ideology of world-mindedness to replace the long-standing habit of divisive feeling. Now, this was not the first time in our world that this suggestion of a global government had been given. In the early 20th century, one of the greatest peacemakers of our time, by the name of Abbas Effendi, also known as Abdu'l-Baha by the Baha'is, visited the United States of America and traveled for a good part of the year there. Whilst in Washington, D.C., one of the high officials of the US government had asked him, how can I best serve my country? His response was, if you want to best serve your country and the world, export the principles of federalism, not the government itself, that underlies your system of government in the United States to the rest of the world. He claimed that creating a world federation was the one untried yet viable system that could unify the world and assure peace. The idea being that humanity was on a journey towards collective maturity marked by widening circles of integration from family to city-state to nation, and the next inevitable stage was owing our loyalty to the planet. Creating a world federation would be the ultimate expression of this next step in our integration. What do we mean by world federation? It means all the independent nations, the 193 boats, erstwhile boats, come together by common consent, so voluntarily, to integrate and to unite to form a central government with limited authority to address common and collective problems by passing binding international laws in limited areas. So we would continue to maintain nation states to be the ones who maintain the responsibility to make decisions closer to home and to be responsible for the welfare and protection of their people and accountable to the international community. Imagine if we had such a system. Imagine if Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine were units of a federated world. Imagine what a world that would be. For one, it would eliminate at least 80% of our wars. Now, there are various components. I'm not going to get into it, but you have a slide here. Main components of a world federation include a world parliament that will, amongst other things, act as the trustee of the whole of mankind and control all the resources and ensure that they're equitably distributed. an executive backed by a standing force that's permanent, and a revamped world court. We already have a world court, and I hope that Kion will speak to it a little bit in his presentation, with compulsory jurisdiction and enforceable judgments. Now, I'd like to propose that while this is the long-term vision, creating a world federation, that we create an interim goal. This is sort of like the climb to Mount Everest. If Mount Everest is our ultimate goal, that being the World Federation, you know, we like to take things in small bites. And even when we administer medicine, we take it in small doses first until the body gets used to it. So the step that I will offer in a second is that of creating a different model short of a world federation. But before we do that, there is a mental shift that is required before we can bridge the gap. And that is understanding that there is a law that applies to society. And that is the law of oneness. It is a law that we have blissfully flouted for years. And now that all our systems are crashing about our ears, we're wondering why it's so. It's because we've essentially failed to take this into account. It would be crazy to try and build an airplane without taking into account the law of gravity, which is a physical law. And yet we've glibly discounted the law of oneness. According to Shoghi Effendi, who is one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, he says that the oneness of the whole body of nations must be made the ruling principle of international life. I apologize for the noise here. So understanding this, and when we look at what our world has been subjected to the last few years, all of the challenges, I believe, have been creating, although disastrous, yes, yet they have also been creating opportunities for us to learn this lesson of oneness. The pandemic, COVID-19, was one of those amazing opportunities. We didn't quite grasp it. We started to learn the lessons. At least the scientists grasped it by banding together, putting aside their egos, and creating in record time 11 vaccines instead of one, and taking 11 months to do it instead of 14 years, which had been the average period prior to that. The recurring wars in Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, each spawning global crises that affect all of us with increasing sincerity: a global energy crisis, an economic crisis, the rampant inflation, the global food crisis, the resurgent threat of nuclear war, etc., etc. So the second thing is suffering. Suffering is going to, unfortunately, it seems because of our choice, is going to be one of the catalysts for us to make this shift. According to the Baha'i writings, suffering stirs the human conscience, causes us to be disillusioned, but it's only when we get to that sort of disillusionment that it prepares us to radically reconceptualize society, which is where we are now, which is why we're having this conversation. And finally, suffering has the role of instilling a sense of responsibility in the leaders of the new age. The trick is to keep an unwavering eye on this goal of oneness. I put this slide up because I've lately come to learn that when race car drivers are being trained, when you get into a spin and you're about to go off the road, one of the tricks is we tend to get fixated on the wall we're going to crash into or the precipice we're about to go off. The thing is to force your head in the direction you want to go, which is the law of oneness. And the car, and this is humanity now, then follows suit more easily. So the last thing I'd like to say is that we said, let's use an interim model. So the medium step, and this is an idea that I've been proposing for the last 20 years, is that humanity think about establishing two systems prior to creating a world federation. And these systems, I believe, as just a personal viewpoint, should be built outside of the UN. The UN, in my belief, has become too much of a bloated bureaucracy to be able to move very nimbly. It does certain things extraordinarily well, and it should continue to do those things. But it has proven incapable of rising to the challenges, the most existential challenges of our time. So the first thing I believe we need to create, using the European coal and steel community as a model, is a supranational global authority fashioned after the European coal and steel community to control and manage critical resources, starting with energy resources, including nuclear energy, in which all the nations of the world would cede all their sovereignty over all these resources to this global authority that would ensure the production and equitable distribution on these materials in quantities that each nation needs in order to survive. Now, the ECSC was successful because it focused on the principles of the fusion of the interests of nations, as opposed to this business of trying to maintain equilibrium, what Henry Kissinger called realpolitik, this constant being on a seesaw, except now we have 193 nations on various seesaws, all trying to achieve equilibrium, which is honestly quite ridiculous, and it's clearly manifestly not working. So we need to think outside the box and do something different, and we have this model. The ECSC also created a shift of culture from confrontation to collaboration between two enemies of hundreds of years, France and Germany. So we start by identifying values. The Baha'i writings say that we need to start by identifying principles and then applying them methodically. The principle of oneness and the principle of equity are two key principles. Arnold Toynbee also talked about the need to identify values first and agree on a set of values that current thinkers refer to as a set of global ethics. The last comment is this: the second global system we need to create is a global system of collective security. In other words, the nations of the world need to come to agreement, starting with a small group, come to an agreement that says, okay, we all need to limit our arms to the amount necessary to maintain order between our borders. Then we'll destroy all the excess arms under international supervision. And if one nation after that arises to flout this agreement, all arise against that nation using the standing force that we talked about. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'm not going to do that. I'll end with this quote from Robert Schuman, who was one of the founders of the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty. He said, world peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. So folks, it's time to act with courage and creativity. If you'd like more details about any of this, feel free to visit our Reimagining Our World podcast. All right, I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Saveda. Fascinating. I've got a couple of points I'd like to ask you later on also about. But we're going to move next to our second speaker, who's Dr. Joshua Lincoln. He's a senior fellow with the Center for International Law and Governance at the Fletcher School of Global Affairs at Tufts, and he is also an advisor to leaders in government, business, nonprofit organizations, and he sits on advisory board of the Cambrian Future Group, and is a member of the New Carbon Economy Consortium. If that wasn't enough, he's actually now working on a current project with governance implications and about the global decarbonization shift, and negotiating currently and implementing a plastics pollution treaty. Fascinating. Joshua, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Saveda. Lovely to be with you all. Sorry, apologies for the overly long bio. The point is a student of international relations and watching the world go by. So I think I'd like to use my time if I can, and I hope, Wendy, you'll keep me to it because there's a lot to say, to contribute a couple thoughts to the conversation, throw a couple things into the pot here and see where we end up. I wanted, because this is the IEF meeting, but it's also happening on the margins of the Summit of the Future, I wanted to try and relate two different things that sort of where we're at in terms of environmental governance versus where we're at in terms of global governance, if I can say the overall system of governance, because I think that there's two different things happening here. And if one were to take a snapshot at this particular moment in time, essentially we would find that on the side of environmental governance, we are still finding our way to a first system, I would argue. And that is happening at the same time as we face a dire need to essentially reform the wider system of global governance that we inherited since World War II. So let me begin with a couple thoughts on the system of environmental governance, then turn over to the reform process underway in the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future, if you'll allow me. We talk about the triple planetary crisis. That's climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss. And it seems to me there's two different sets of challenges. Climate change is arguably the most pressing issue. We don't have to wade into literally the details of that. I think we can take that as a given. But the main challenge that occurs with respect to climate change and the emerging system, talking about the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Compact, the UAE consensus from last year, is that it is a struggle for effectiveness rather. The proof of concept of the Paris Agreement, this idea that we can move from commitments to curb fossil fuels to a system of national determined contributions, has yet to really prove itself. In 2024, 9 years out from the agreement, we're still waiting. Important things have happened. There are milestones along the way. We could discuss those. But the challenge of effectiveness remains with respect to this emerging system on climate change. In contrast, the two systems on what we would call pollution and biodiversity are highly fragmented. There, the problem is a different one. You have a whole host of agreements, important ones, all negotiated over the last 20, 30 years. Including some in the last 10. But they're all negotiated in a stovepipe fashion. They all have their own COPs, their own processes, their own logics, their own funding systems. They don't relate to each other, and they do not form part of a coherent whole. If you take those two sets of problems and you then get to add a third, which is there is no overarching governance to the system, to the environmental system as a whole. Many, including the IEF, the Climate Governance Commission, others have done important work putting forward proposals for how to close that gap. And I think that is, I'm certainly a supporter of a number of those proposals, including the idea of an Earth Systems Council that would provide an overall way of managing these issues. That kind of logic, that kind of overarching logic exists in other fields. It exists in human rights, for example. It exists in peace and security. One can take issue with the performance of the Security Council, but the logic of the system as a whole is there. We'll come back to this, but one of the challenges of the current proposals, the Pact of the Future and so on, is that kind of proposal, that kind of big thinking is absent from the document. And that is something that we have to contend with. So with those couple of thoughts on the nature, the current sort of challenges of environmental governance, I want to now flip back over to the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future, and sort of I'll begin with a thought about how we got here. A colleague of mine in Brown University, Justin Hayner, is doing a project on treaties. Treaties are an interesting indicator of the relationship and the intensification of relationships between states. He's cataloged about 80,000 treaties since Westphalia, since 1648, so the last 4 centuries, about 80,000 treaties. 3/4 of those, 58,000, have occurred since World War II. If you do the averages, on average, in the 1800s, 1700s, we were talking about 20 treaties a year, and these were often peace treaties in which, one king had defeated another and made him sign a peace treaty, to a situation today where we're basically averaging about 1,000 treaties a year on every possible subject under the sun. That is a really interesting indicator to think about. We have moved from a system where some states interacted some of the time on some issues, usually on a transactional basis, usually largely on the basis of national interest and nationally defined territoriality, whether it was territory itself, the seas, the oceans, the rivers, or space. to a system now today where basically almost all states are interacting almost all the time on almost all of the issues of concern. And that is what we might call much more a system of global governance, but what we're inching towards is a system of planetary governance. The distinction being that the second one takes the planet as its basic theater of consideration. And that itself was missing up until very recently, and provides now the challenge of the present. We can argue between us about where my fishing rights are and where your fishing rights are, but if the seas are rising and the fish stocks are depleting as a result of a couple of other reasons, then we have a problem well above and beyond whose fishing grounds are whose. And that seems to be the kind of the evolution or the current challenge that is really accelerated roughly, it's very hard in my mind, since the millennium. And we this kind of evolution, this stretch to moving from a global governance concept to something approaching a planetary governance concept, which we have not yet reached, is something that is still very much ahead of us, or that we are beginning to tackle now. And that is a very profound change, and each of these changes actually are quite profound and important and messy and interesting as a result. And I think we should, as much as one wants to see the alleviation of the problems themselves, it might be a mistake to rush a process in which there is a gradual collective learning about how to deal with specific areas of human challenges, or the planetary challenges rather. So I see that trend personally quite clearly. This brings me to the present moment, the Summit of the Future. This UN, it's no big news, has been struggling to deliver. Saveda made reference to it, has been struggling to deliver for years. And politically, what's interesting is that many leaders are now very, very explicit about this. This is recent. This is the last 2, 3, 4 years. It's hard to find anyone anywhere now who argues that the United Nations system and global governance is working just great. And so that gradual, I suppose, that gradual coming of conviction, and the fact that it is no longer a minority phenomenon, but increasingly certainly a majority phenomenon, perhaps a totality consensus phenomenon, is itself interesting. That doesn't take away from the fact that we tend to be stronger on the diagnosis than on the prognosis, and that perhaps is where we end up on the Summit of the Future. The last great push at reform was 2005 under Kofi Annan, and he issued a report called In Larger Freedom at the time. And the interesting thing is, In Larger Freedom was entirely concerned with reform of the UN organization itself. It did not include the international financial institutions. It did not include the SDGs. It did not include the environment or climate change. All of those issues were not yet in the global consciousness as needing to be considered as part of a single agenda, which is what the Pact for the Future and the Summit for the Future does. In 19 short years, we have moved from a concern with just the mechanics of how the UN worked to trying to think about all of these related problems in the same way. In 2005, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were sort of a new phenomenon. Today, we are halfway towards implementation of the SDGs, and they have become a common language by which Zambia and Chile and Portugal can speak to each other about common issues of development and human well-being. So from that standpoint, it's a significant place. It's a significant moment. Secretary General Guterres called for the Summit of the Future a couple of years ago in the midst of the pandemic in 2021. He wanted to talk about a more inclusive and networked multilateralism, by which he meant a couple different things. It turns out in the interim that many member states are not that keen to talk about the networked or the inclusive parts of that. And so we find ourselves back looking and really framing the conversation on First Avenue at the United Nations this coming week. The conversation is still fundamentally framed in a narrow state-centered manner. Having said that, there are large opportunities and a couple of interesting developments that we can look at. The Pact for the Future, there are 3 documents coming out of the summit for those people who don't follow this all day long. The Pact for the Future is supposed to be the most practical and detailed one. It is 30 pages. I think Arthur mentioned 58 or 60 action points, depending on what you count. And Rev 4 was open for comments and objections until 5 p.m. last night. And I suspect that there were probably going to be, as in the previous 3 rounds, a set of objections by member states. It's being, let's say, debated and contested in a very healthy manner. So anything I say about the pact itself might be obsolete as we speak, but that's the nature of these things. Most likely, negotiations will go right into the end of the middle of next week, or the beginning of this next week, actually, in that sense. The takeaway is probably that the Pact for the Future does not offer the dramatic departure or the major innovations that much of civil society had hoped for. It chips away at many existing global governance issues, not exclusively UN ones, and need a reform, and it identifies, it sort of earmarks all the specific existing, often struggling, narrower reform processes that are part of the system already in one area or another. The other 2 documents are the Global Digital Compact, which is interesting. It's less sort of specific, but it aims to create a framework to address digital issues and digital, how do we say this, a new global framework for the use of digital technology. And the third document, which from my mind is an interesting one, even though it's the least practical and the most aspirational one, is the Declaration on Future Generations. And this is intended a little bit the way the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was intended. It's not a treaty. It doesn't carry specific commitments. It sort of sets a framework, an aspirational framework that says, listen, so far, there's a deficit here. We have not thought about the rights and the well-being of future generations, and we need to find a way to bring them into every conversation. And there's been what is under negotiation, the pact, is the idea of a special envoy for future generations, who is somebody who, with the declaration in one hand, could then go into every meeting or forum, and perhaps we would see others, and raise these issues and say, well, how does this discussion about nuclear weapons or this discussion about carbon dioxide removal impact future generations, and put that issue on the table. So the pact itself, I have a minute and a half. I will point to sort of 2 ideas that are coming out of it that are interesting. The first is that the largest amount of recommendations within it really deal with sustainable development financing for development. And this reflects a growing demand by a large majority of developing states to have more of a say in the marshaling of financial resources to deal with a range of vexing global problems. This is new. They are not content anymore with the IMF and the World Bank sitting in Washington, D.C. and being controlled in one way, and the UN General Assembly sitting up in New York and dealing with things in a different way. And so there is a consistent pressure, an increasing voice and ownership by the developing countries, the small island states, the emerging economies, to say, no, we need to bring these different strands together in a way that gives us greater control over the financial resources with which to deal with all of these global problems. That's an interesting process. On peace and security, similarly, there's been 8 months of separate negotiations on a lot of this ends up being about the Security Council. And while nobody has agreed on anything as a specific outcome, there has been a narrowing, I would call it a narrowing of the pathway towards those negotiations that is interesting. It is the result of 3 things: a daily reminder that the Security Council is ineffective through the Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan conflicts, a long-standing, simmering dissatisfaction with membership of the Security Council, and a nice practical deadline of the Summit of the Future. The result of those 3 things has been to provide more of an outcome than I think anybody really thought possible in terms of narrowing the pathway to some reform of the Security Council down the road. So I think that closes my time.
Thank you so much, Joshua. There are many issues you brought up there that I'm sure will come out in the later conversations. We're now going to turn to our third speaker and final speaker, Payam Akavan. He's there. I know he's doing some fighting today. Okay, he's there. It's great. He's a human rights chair at Massey College, University of Toronto. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and he's a special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. He served as counsel to the Commission on Small Island States in the historic climate change proceedings before the international courts and tribunals. Over to you, Payam.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and I'm grateful to the International Environment Forum for inviting me alongside two dear friends and distinguished colleagues of many years, Soveda and Joshua, and I've greatly benefited from their remarks, which set the stage for my focus on the turn by small island states, which are the canary in the coal mine of climate catastrophe, as I will explain, to international courts and tribunals in order to address the power disparity between them as the smallest of nations and the major polluters whose failure to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions has brought those small island states in certain cases to the brink of extinction. Some of them will literally disappear as a result of sea level rise in the foreseeable future. By way of introductory remarks, at the outset, I think my colleague Soveda addressed some of the basic Baha'i principles which shapes our outlook. One of those, of course, is the oneness of humankind, which today, far from being a lofty ideal, is an inescapable reality in view of global interdependence. And nothing is, in my view, as powerful a reminder of this interdependence as the problem of climate change, which quintessentially transcends all of the artificial boundaries that we have created, and which threatens really the continuation of humankind. It is not just a problem of the environment, but a problem which could potentially result in the collapse of civilization, as I will set out briefly. The second point is that the achievement of a world commonwealth of effective global governance is, of course, not something that will happen with the wave of a magic wand suddenly. It's part of an organic historical process. And I will perhaps now turn a bit to the historical background of international courts and tribunals before addressing how, in recent times, in an extraordinary exercise of planetary politics, small island states have turned to international law in order to address this fundamental challenge to the survival of humankind. And of course, one of the basic elements of an international order based on justice is the application of principles of international law, including to the problems of climate change. So in 1899, at the Hague Peace Conference, the Permanent Court of Arbitration was established. And the basic premise was that instead of going to war, nations would, as a last resort, have recourse to peaceful means of dispute settlement, including binding arbitration. The issues in 1899 were largely ones of war and peace, whereas today international law has proliferated to include everything from protection of the environment to human rights to trade and a host of other issues. The physical structure that would house the Permanent Court of Arbitration, known as the Peace Palace, and those of you who visited The Hague will see this imposing structure. Its construction was concluded in 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of the First World War. And of course, following the conclusion of the First World War in 1918, the League of Nations was established, and under the auspices of the League of Nations, an institution called the Permanent Court of International Justice was established in 1922, which was also housed together with the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the same Peace Palace. And following the conclusion of the Second World War and the adoption of the UN Charter in 1945, the principal judicial organ of the UN became the International Court of Justice, which is also housed in the Peace Palace. There is, of course, an international criminal court which addresses questions of individual criminal liability. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'll be focusing on the International Court of Justice and another specialized tribunal called the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, known by the acronym of ITLOS, which is based in Hamburg, Germany, and it was established under the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is otherwise known as the Constitution of the Oceans. And of course, the oceans have a particularly important role to play in the sense that the climate system is essentially based on ocean currents. Those of you who are students of science or even from your high school education will remember this conveyor belt which carries warm water from the tropics to the poles and cold water back from the poles to the tropics. And that essentially is what regulates temperature on Earth. And the oceans are by far the biggest sink for the excess heat created by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, some 93% of excess heat is absorbed by the oceans. So protection of the marine environment from excess heat is fundamental to regulating the climate system. In 1988, Dr. James Hansen, NASA scientist, for the first time introduced the idea of climate change, global warming in his testimony before the United States Congress. And 4 years later in 1992, at the so-called Rio Earth Summit in Brazil, otherwise known as the UN Conference on Development and the Environment, the participating states adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This treaty was intended to be a basis for nations to address climate change by progressively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In 2015, under that framework convention, the Paris Agreement was concluded, and based on incontrovertible scientific evidence, including the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the objective of the Paris Agreement was to ensure that temperature rise is limited to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius in excess of pre-industrial temperatures. That goal, of course, has now become increasingly difficult to achieve because over the past 30 years, the nations of the world and the major polluters in particular have conspicuously failed to immediately and radically mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to the point where, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, instead of being on target to remain within 1.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, the current nationally determined contributions or voluntary commitments of the major polluters are such that we are set to achieve 2.8 degrees Celsius, or twice what is required to avert catastrophic climate change. And from the perspective of small island states that are particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels, to unprecedented extreme weather events, to increasingly intense surges, In addition to the bleaching of coral reefs, the extinction of marine biodiversity, fish stocks, and all of the other elements on which they are dependent, the small island states from the very beginning had the most to lose by the failure of the major polluters to take the necessary action. They tried within the framework of the Paris Agreement, which is essentially a consensual model where nations meet annually at what is known as the Conference of Parties, or COP, the last one being in Dubai in COP28 last year. This year's event is COP29 in Baku. The nations of the world have ensured, the major polluters in particular, that there is no binding mechanism obligating them to meet any specific targets, notwithstanding the scientific evidence showing what is required to avert catastrophic climate change. So the Paris Agreement allows states to unilaterally determine what their contribution will be to mitigation. And even if they fail to meet those inadequate unilateral commitments, there is no means to hold them to account. It was in this context that I was approached by the prime ministers of two small island states, Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, population 100,000, and Tuvalu in the South Pacific, population 10,000, to explore how international law could be invoked by the small island states, really as a measure of desperation and frustration at the lack of progress over the past 30 years. And it was remarkable to see the expression on the faces of the prime ministers when I told them that much of what they have tried over the past 30 years to achieve through negotiations without success is already part of binding international law. Students of international law may be familiar with a famous case called the Trail Smelter case from 1939, when Canada and the United States entered into binding arbitration because a smelter in the town of Trail in British Columbia was spewing noxious fumes from its chimneys across the border into Washington state, where it was causing serious damage to forests and farms. And the arbitral tribunal established the principle of transboundary harm, that a state cannot allow activity on its territory which will create significant harm to other states. And of course, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, one may not have the immediate cause and effect that one would have with spewing noxious fumes across the border or dumping toxic waste in the sea of a coastal state. But the principle remains the same, that the major polluters are knowingly engaging in conduct that is causing harm, in certain cases, catastrophic harm to climate vulnerable states. Bearing that in mind, two initiatives began, both led by small island states, which is quite remarkable. The first was an initiative by Vanuatu, another small island state in the South Pacific, to bring an advisory opinion request before the International Court of Justice. Now, an advisory opinion is not binding in the same way as a dispute between two states. And in any event, many of the major polluters have ensured that they do not accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice or of any other jurisdiction, exactly because they want to have the latitude to do as they please. So an advisory opinion, although not binding, is an authoritative statement of the law. And even if we don't have immediate means of enforcement, the power of legitimacy that derives from international law is still a very important tool in the toolbox for climate vulnerable states. The problem with the ICJ was that it required a majority vote of the UN General Assembly, because states cannot individually request an advisory opinion from the ICJ. This is why, in addition to the political campaign that was led by Vanuatu to secure majority of votes in the UN General Assembly, a commission of small island states was established by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu, which quickly grew to encompass 9 small island states from the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this commission was empowered to request an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, specific to the protection of the marine environment and the oceans. And despite skepticism that small island states could pull such a feat off successfully, on May 21st of this year, the 21 judges of the Law of the Sea Tribunal delivered a unanimous advisory opinion, basically recognizing that greenhouse gas emissions are like oil spills and toxic waste and all other forms of pollution, a form of pollution that triggered exacting obligations to take all necessary measures to ensure that harm is not caused to the marine environment of other states. And that precedent also will help shape the ongoing proceedings before the ICJ, which beyond protection of the marine environment will also consider wider questions relating to the impact of climate change on human rights, on the right of self-determination. And that proceeding is ongoing with an unprecedented 91 UN member states and international organizations participating. All this to say that we see here an organic process where we have climate change as an unprecedented existential challenge for the survival of humankind. And in view of the failure of the major powers, the major polluters, to take the laws of nature seriously, it's Tuvalu, population 10,000, banding together with small island states to basically, as I said earlier, exercise planetary politics and inject this vital process of negotiation with normative content, that normative content being binding international law obligations to ensure that catastrophic harm does not occur. And as a final point, to perhaps explain the urgency of this matter for small island nations such as Tuvalu, I will ask Christine Muller if she could kindly project this image. This image shows the island of Funafuti, which is the largest of this atoll, which is the island nation of Tuvalu. And you will see that with no sea level rise on the left-hand side, there is still some degree of flooding, which is extensive on the island, especially at high tide or when there are storm surges. On the left, you will see that at 2 degrees Celsius, at just 2 degrees Celsius, there would be a 34 centimeter rise in sea level, which would essentially make the island uninhabitable. So from the perspective of Tuvalu, preventing sea level rise, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is immediate and urgent and indispensable for their survival, which is why I refer to these small island nations as the canary in the coal mine of climate catastrophe. What is happening to them today will happen to the rest of the world tomorrow. And it remains to be seen how this unprecedented chapter in the history of international law will come to shape our evolution towards effective global governance. Thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize in advance if at some point I may have to jump off this call, but I am very grateful once again for the opportunity to address you.
Thank you so much, Payam. So fascinating, and a slide so dramatic as well there at the end, showing what's probably going on in degrees right now in that space. It's really horrifying for people living there to realize they're going to be underwater shortly if we don't do something now. we're going to just now enter about 15 or 20 minutes of conversation among various panelists, and there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions in the chat as well. But this is now a time for the panelists to sort of reflect with each other on what's been said and how their themes, which seem perhaps very different from one another, are actually the same theme in different aspects. So over to you, and I think it's a jump in rather than hands raising. Got comments to make, please do.
I
Yes, please.
I had an immediate question for Saveda, which is if to hear just one more minute on the European coal and steel example that you gave, and how you were thinking about that as a transitional mechanism, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, so you know, Jean Monnet, who came up with the idea for the European coal and steel community, actually wanted to create a federation of Europe, but recognized that the Europeans weren't ready for it. So he said, if we can take a narrow area of economic activity, create a supranational institution, build confidence and trust that it can work, then we can add links to this chain. So along the lines that you like to talk about, organic process, right? And eventually build it out and make it a European federation. That's where he hoped this whole project, the European project, would go. We've gotten stuck. We're sort of in retarded sort of teenage throes of adolescence, and we're refusing to take that final step. So what I found fascinating in the extensive research that I've done on this topic is that when you analyze how this system worked, 6 countries in Europe came together and gave up essentially what today would be, say, the oil and gas of today. So imagine Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, all these countries who are oil rich coming together and saying, yes, we agree to cede sovereignty over our oil and gas to a supranational institution, because they concluded that it would be in their best interests as individual nations to do this rather than try to go it alone. That was the first fascinating thing. And it's fascinating to read the debates that were occurring in the parliaments at the time. You know, people are absolutely flabbergasted. Wait a minute, you want to create this institution that's not elected. So the members of the supranational institution were appointed. However, one of the rules was they were not there to represent their nations. They were there to represent the collective interests of the whole. So the principles of oneness and equality were firmly embedded in the whole structure and the process of the ECSC. So that was the first thing. Secondly, they would act as an electoral college. So majority vote, no veto power. They would not be funded by governments. They would be funded by basically a tax on the sorry, I've been ill, so words are not coming easily. The products, once they sold the coal and steel, a 1% tax would be levied, and that would be used to fund the European coal and steel community. There are all these, you know, fascinating aspects of it. Then if they had the authority to bind nations, even though the people of those nations had not elected them. So the courts, this is where this idea first came about. The courts of the member nations could be used to enforce the rules created by the high authority of the European coal and steel community. And there could be penalties levied also against individuals and corporations and governments. So this fascinating system that is set up on these principles of equity, and it was premised on the fact that Jean Monnet wanted France and Germany, even though he was a Frenchman, to be on an equal footing. He didn't believe that denigrating one nation or the other would lead to anything good. So my idea has been for years now to take this as an example and create a global supranational institution for energy, including nuclear energy, because by doing that, and I don't want to get into details here, I've written 2 whole books on this, you can tackle 3 global challenges of today: the inequitable distribution of energy, which really came into full view with the Ukraine war and the energy crisis, climate change, right, and nuclear proliferation. You tackle those 3, you've demonstrated to the world that you've got a system that works. Once you do that, you can then build this out and add more capabilities to it. And build this out alongside the UN, and maybe at some point in the future they merge, maybe not. Maybe we end up with two sets of institutions. Let the UN do what it's good at doing, and don't try to force it to do things it's just really proven itself incapable of doing. And frankly, I have very little hope that we don't have time. I'm just going to say, this is going to be my first comment, and then I'll be quiet. There is a tsunami coming, and I'm listening to this conversation that the three of us have been having, and I'm thinking a tsunami is coming, and we're thinking, oh yes, progressive, let's put a few sandbags here and a few sandbags there. We don't have time. These are, as Pam said, these are existential threats. We won't be around to have these learned conversations 50 years from now. We need to do something now. That's why I'm with Arnold Toynbee. Existential threats, climate change, nuclear proliferation, either of those are going to take us out. We're not going to have much to work with. So we need to get past this kind of let's build things out really slowly. There's some things we've got to build out really fast, and that's why I think the supranational authority and a system of collective security, got to have that. Without it, we're goners. So that's it.
Thanks, Savannah. Strongly put. And Josh, do you want to come back on any of that yourself?
I had, mine was a genuine question to understand what Savannah was explaining, which I've now gotten, and I respect and salute the passion. I think we all feel it. But I would add that we live in a complicated world where the people, at least at this table or on this forum, don't control the votes in the Security Council or anywhere else. So we live in the world which we inhabit, literally. I see that there have been a couple of questions in the chat. They're addressed to some of us, one or two to me. I'm conscious though that we want to take advantage of Payam's presence before he has to leave us. So I don't know if Payam had a question or a comment or wanted to add something, but I yield my time to him for the present.
No, please continue, Joshua. Please continue.
Okay. Well, I was asked one question, if I can, by, I think it's Peter, right? Relating to the Pact for the Future. And I think wait and see the final version. But I would say one of the achievements of the Pact is actually that it places all the salient difficulties that humanity faces in one document. And I have to say, I haven't actually seen that before in quite this way. 30 pages, dense, 60 action points, but it is a pretty complete listing, a litany of all the problems that ail us and of some of the existing procedures and processes underway to try and solve them. All of them inadequate. But that itself seems an important starting point. It lacks the big ideas and the innovations. It makes no reference to charter review, for example. Under Article 108, you can amend the UN Charter. Under Article 109, you could call an actual charter review conference. Interestingly, the document doesn't take up either one of those ideas. There have been some efforts, lots of civil society efforts over the years to propose interesting amendments, revisions, all the rest of it. In essence, I think the document is a bit timid and tortured and in its answer to the scale of the problems, to Saveda's point. What it does well is it reflects pretty comprehensively where we are. And I think this is true of the summit as well. So, there have been lots of cheeky one-liners so far, but one of them is that this is a summit of the present, not of the future. And it is a pact of the present, not of the future. And therefore that the search for solutions will absolutely have to continue at scale well beyond this in order to bring a lot of these ideas and principles that are inching forward into more significant reality against the backdrop of the urgency that Saveda makes reference to. The important thing is the conversation globally is more inclusive than it has ever been. And I don't mean just in terms of the numbers of states in the developing states. I mean the inclusion of indigenous people, the participation of women, the voices of youth, and this growing concept about representing the rights and the interests of the unborn. I mean, those of us who live in democracies know quite well. It's well known, social science. The elderly vote, and therefore in democracies, the fallible side of democracies is that they represent only the living, those who vote. And those who vote most are best represented. So in any democracy, actually, The elderly vote more than the young, and the unborn don't vote at all. And so actually beginning to compensate for this, if you think about this single principle, it might be partially to blame for the triple planetary crisis that we find ourselves in. So, these are important sort of benchmark insights that the world is grappling with in some new ways. So, I think that would be my short-term response to Peter. There are some more actionable aspects to document. We don't have the time to go into them now. I'm glad to discuss them offline. None of them are very encouraging on climate change, but that's why we need the kind of legal action that PIAM has been working on. There is an interesting acceleration on the legal side that is bringing greater and greater pressure by small island states, developing states, emerging economies. These are the new players. We're definitely past this sort of unipolar, possibly multipolar moment and into something new. The most interesting initiatives that are being brought are on Security Council reform are being brought by the likes of Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, on climate change by Tuvalu, on the reform of financial institutions by Barbados. This is not an accident. These are the smaller, more nimble nations of the world that are beginning to play a greater role. Costa Rica is a leader in a class of its own in a range of different areas. You finding smaller, developing, emerging economies, landlocked states, island states that are finding a way forward. And because of the interlinked nature of the system as a whole, they cannot be ignored. And that's really interesting to observe. So sorry, went on too long, but that would be my comment.
Thanks so much, Joshua. That's great. Pam, did you want to come in on any of that, with your involvement with small island states?
Well, yes, I being the prophet of doom and gloom, I'd like to put a somewhat more positive spin on what we're experiencing. And, I'm a legal academic, and in the social sciences, one grapples with all sorts of ideological debates and what have you. And I've been working with natural scientists in recent times, with world's leading authorities on ocean currents, for example, and what have you. And it is really refreshing and reassuring to talk to people who simply give you the measurements and tell you about the laws of nature. So the point here is it doesn't matter what the leaders of the world say or do. The laws of nature will take their own course. And that is not just a cause for consternation. It's also a cause for celebration, because finally, this materialistic civilization, which Shoghi Effendi in the Baha'i writings called cancerous, has brought us to the limits and is going to be a rude awakening for those of us who think we're at the center of the universe. We're about to be reminded that we are an insignificant speck in an infinite universe, and that the earth will go on with or without us. Now, one of the remarkable things working with the South Pacific nations, which are indigenous peoples, is there a profound understanding of the connection between spirituality and the natural world, something which Abdu'l-Baha wrote about more than 100 years ago, saying that the indigenous peoples would become spiritual leaders in the future. And one of the most extraordinary moments in my legal career was sitting in the courtroom when the Attorney General of Vanuatu, an indigenous man from a very small island, stood up and told the judges, if you respect nature, nature will respect you. It was powerful in the simplicity with which it was put forward. And what is it? Simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. He was reminding us of an obvious truth, that when you attend the COP negotiations in the so-called VVIP section, that truth is entirely lacking because of the cynicism and myopia which passes for leadership. So the point that I'm trying to get at is, I believe in the resilience of humankind, although the question is, how much pain will we have to suffer until we wake up? Now, the clock is ticking. Nature is beginning to enforce her laws. Mother Nature is speaking to us gently in whispers at first, but soon she will be yelling, and we have no choice but to listen. And just to end, I am moved to go back to a quote which I read many years during my youth from The Promised Day Has Come. And now, in light of this reality, it takes on an entirely different meaning. So Shoghi Effendi wrote, "The world is in truth moving on towards its destiny. The interdependence of the peoples and nations of the earth, whatever the leaders of the divisive forces of the world may say or do, is already an accomplished fact." And of course, this was written many decades ago. But then in the end of that famous quotation that we've all heard, he says something that we should reflect on again. "Adversity, prolonged, worldwide, afflictive, allied to chaos and universal destruction, must needs convulse the nations, steer the conscience of the world, disillusion the masses, precipitate a radical change in the very conception of society, and coalesce ultimately the disjointed, the bleeding limbs of mankind into one body, single, organically united, and indivisible." And the final point following that quotation is that this isn't just a question of world leaders getting together and concluding an agreement. It's a question of a radical transformation in our very way of life, because we are addicted to consumer capitalism, and we are sleepwalking over the edge of the cliff. When people, even in Canada, which is one of the most advanced democracies in the world, very internationalist in its orientation, when people say, "I would rather fill up the tank of my SUV for $5 less than to pay a carbon tax to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions," that shows you that it is the people as well who have to demand of their leaders decisive action to save future generations and the planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Poem, for that. Josh, I saw your hand up, and then I have a question for Saveda as well.
There was a question in the chat on the plastics treaty process. May I have a minute to answer that? Is that all right? Yeah, lovely. The plastics treaty process is a sort of a perfect illustration of almost everything we've talked about so far, to me, all happening inside one sort of channel, which is the attempt to find an answer to the growing massive problem of plastics pollution worldwide, which affects the full life cycle along the full life cycle of plastic. We don't have time to go into it, but I think it is running into trouble. If you're familiar with following these negotiations, 4 rounds down, 1 round to go, it is running into trouble because of exactly what Payam and Arthur were mentioning in the chat, essentially the commercial interests of states and of those major big oil firms that are in partnership with them, oil producing states in particular, and their commercial partners. Because plastics, in the end, 99% of it, the feedstocks for plastics are oil, and so it is a byproduct. Petrochemical industry is a byproduct of an oil industry, of an oil economy. So there's a very serious set of questions now about whether or not the agreement will have any substantial core obligations with respect to capping plastic or taking harmful chemicals out of plastics, or massively increasing recycling and some of the other things that need to happen on the downstream side of this. All of that is up for grabs. I would say 2 positive things to this. The agenda is now on the table, and everybody is increasingly aware of this, and it is going to get resolved over time. But it is going to take time from that perspective, because the one bang solution is not probably going to carry the day. The negotiations are going to be interesting to watch. One of the interesting things for me is the very calling of the negotiations process prompted a huge amount of additional scientific research, back to Payam's point about science getting into the global affairs in a more relevant manner. A profusion of reports and of research in the 2 or 3 years leading up to this negotiations and during it have uncovered, in a way, the scale and the depth of the problem for us in a way that would never have happened had we not actually started the process of arguing about it around a negotiating table. And then the last piece of this is that I'm writing about this with a colleague of mine. We're talking about the the strong bones of weak treaties. We're trying to make the argument, it exists out there already, there exists in environmental negotiations, of the start and strengthen concept, which is even if you can't agree on really strong substantive obligations at the outset, create a treaty, design a treaty with a structure so that it allows for strengthening over time. You create a process, this will be familiar to many of us, by which we start working together. The act of working together creates a community and a culture and allows us over time to achieve that which we could not agree at the negotiating table before having started to work together. And I think there's a lot of promise in that. It's been seen to work in other areas. I'm familiar with some of it in peace and security myself, but I think this is some of the approach that we're going to see more of going forward. Sorry for the length of that. Back over to you, Wendy.
So that's also brilliant. Thank you so much. I just wanted to also, that answered some of it, I think, too. But also, Saveda, you mentioned in your talk about the mindset change that needed to take place. And Payam also mentioned that mindset change. And again, one of the other questions there was, the kinds of changes steps that need to be taken at the sort of local and, individual and community levels before we can get, I mean, you mentioned things have to be done very quickly, but do not things have to also happen within the individual and then with the community before they can, think can stick at the international level? Just your observations on that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, this is a recurring question and an interesting one. We have to proceed on both fronts, and sometimes we fall into false dichotomies, and the Baha'is are no exception to falling into this trap that we have to wait for individual transformation of a majority of people on planet Earth before we can create these institutions. We're running out of time. So, for instance, creating a system of collective security has to happen now. And my analysis of the Baha'i writings is it's very clear it's going to be one of the very first things that happens. And in a recent message from the Universal House of Justice, the governing body of the Baha'i faith, they very clearly, they wrote it during the pandemic, they said that we're hoping that as this process continues, it will result eventually in the creation of an international order in which the majority of the nations will participate, that will in which basically they don't mention collective security, but in which they say essentially there'll be a way to guarantee peace and there will be a mechanism for enforcing it. So that's everything that Shoghi Effendi wrote about in terms of his definition of collective security. So to me, that was very fascinating because I've been sort of having this conversation for years and had a lot of pushback that, no, this is in the long distance future. And I was saying, no, we can't. Just logically, it doesn't work because we won't be around if we wait that long. But at the same time, in order for something to stick long term, yes, we need to also work on changing hearts and minds. And there's a third thing that is sort of a halfway thing. We have to be able to identify what a lot of thinkers of the last 15 years have been referring to as a shared system of global ethics. Identifying them, agreeing upon them, and then methodically applying them. Arnold Toynbee, interestingly, also referred to this. He said it's actually going to be impossible to create this limited form of world government that sticks unless you identify a system of shared values. And then he gets really specific. He says, let's just, bottom line, we have to have a shared system of understanding the difference between right and wrong, which I found really interesting. And then he goes a step further and he says, look, the truth is, as a world historian, looking at history, this has only ever happened when new religions have come and injected these values and this sense of right and wrong. And when people then are able to look towards this point of unity, something above themselves, if Josh has an opinion of how the world should go and Payam has one and you have one and I have one, none of us is willing to sit back and give the other 20 years to see whether their system works. But if we can all look to a system that is supra individual and comes from a source that we consider a divine source, that has a plan for us all, perhaps, and knows better than we do, then that could be a point of unity. So I think that the work that Baha'i communities are doing around the world to create these spaces in which from childhood, children get to learn about some of these shared values, like the oneness of humanity. And I want to make clear to audience who are not members of the Baha'i faith that we're not talking about values that you're cramming down people's throats that are, you know, this is not religion. These are ethics, like the oneness of humanity. I mean, who would disagree with that? Or that things should be fair, you know, or that in an interconnected world, the advantage of the part can only be guaranteed by guaranteeing the advantage of the whole. So that in a body, it becomes really silly for the diseased liver, for the liver to say to the diseased kidneys, I don't care if you're diseased and have cancer, I'm out for number one, which is what we do now with our, you know, various slogans of this nation first or that nation first. And it becomes nonsensical, as we've discussed in the context of climate change. This sort of behavior no longer makes sense. So I think these both need to go together, and at times we may need to ramp up work in one area more than the other. Progress is not going to be even in both areas. And yeah, I think that's enough said.
Thanks so much, Saveda. I see that Arthur has joined us, and he's put a few questions in himself. Arthur, would you like to say a few words, please?
Thank you. I think following on from what Saveda said, you know, yes, you know, we can agree on certain values, but we have created institutions in our society that couldn't care less about values. You know, the corporate structures, the economy, the investors, and so on. There's a massive power that the only value is creating more profits for the shareholders. And they are not, there's no governance for them. You know, they escape from all these debates in the United Nations, you know, among states and so on and so forth. There's very powerful actors corrupting society and driving us in the wrong direction. So much of the failure of the UN system and the agreements there has been the failure to confront and somehow control those dimensions of our society. You know, I worked with small island states 50 years ago as a scientific advisor to all the Pacific Island countries. I drafted the island section of Agenda 21 in 1992. I've been coordinating the UN system-wide Earthwatch, all the science trying to get governments to change. So with 50 years of effort, we still haven't gotten the message across to those other parts of society that couldn't care less. That's another enormous gap in governance we need to fill somehow. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. I mean, that's a very powerful point. And sometimes, I mean, somebody mentioned it, you know, we've been waving the red flag for years, one of the participants said. And, you know, how do we engender a sense of urgency, not just in the individual, not just in the community, but in the institutions that all of us are working with, and not allowing people to give up or you know, feel sort of, you know, that they might as well just dig a hole and lie in it, you know. I mean, how do we get that change of thinking? Joshua, please.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this exact question for the last couple of minutes, given that we're sort of we're all walking around the elephant and blindfolded and sort of you know, trying to figure out what we're holding on to. I wanted to just make reference to the Baha'i International Community's statement, Embracing Interdependence, which has just been released for the Summit of the Future. For those of you who are interested, it's online. Just search Embracing Interdependence. And what is interesting about that statement is that it returns to principles, and it urges consideration of the implications of the principle of the oneness of humanity rather than advocating or making a set of proposals specifically. So in a way, it's germane to what we're talking about. My personal feeling is that in a way, if I can think about the three models, or perhaps the four represented here by Saveda, myself, Payam, and Arthur, the imperative is to do all four at the same time. to explicitly register impatience and to wave the red flag, to to find the strategic avenues of action. Payam's example, international legal litigation, but everyone has an avenue they can pick. Basically, pick a field of action. The third is to remain realistic in our assessment of the forces at play in the world, and not to live in a sort of an alternate reality. We are where we are, and the world is struggling through this. But to also be able to call out the forces behind some of these things. I think Arthur's point with respect to business and commercial interests is one of the remaining really significant challenges. In a way, finding an answer to the behavior of governments. Governments behave in a way that can be understood more easily than businesses and transnational corporate interests do. And we have not really yet tackled some of those things in that way. That's still ahead of us. So in my mind, there has to be a balance between the urgency, the red flag, the positivity, the practical engagement, the pragmatism, and not deluding ourselves at the same time about the moment that we're in and the challenge of it and the opportunity of it, and to also see these longer, wider trends at play. People were concerned about the state of the world in the 1950s. They were enormously concerned about nuclear weapons in the 1950s. There have been other moments in history where some of these overriding concerns have really, really driven popular fears and perceptions, and the entire language of the period was framed by these things. Somehow humanity works its way through that point and will probably find its way with some bruises and some very difficult choices along the way through this current stage. Anyway, that's a personal view entirely.
If I could jump in, Wendy, you asked particularly, how do we create optimism in people or renew hope, right? So that they won't want to just go dig themselves a hole. So yes to what Josh said. And I think it's really important when you understand why things are happening the way they are. That to me gives hope, why it's happening and where is it all leading to. And this idea that we have in the faith of these twin processes of integration and disintegration that Shoukh Effendi says are both accelerating, so both accelerating, and eventually will come to a climax. And both have the same goal. So even the disintegrative processes have the goal, he says, of tearing down the barriers that have hindered humanity from recognizing its oneness. So we're back to the principle of oneness. And the processes of integration, the process of integration is also there to tear down these barriers. Both are absolutely essential because humanity will not, individuals in nations will not hold the feet, will not, first of all, elect the kinds of leaders that are fit and worthy, and then will not hold the feet of those leaders to the fire and demand that they create regulations, for instance, to rein in the corporations. I mean, the absence of regulations, the role that corporations play in politics and elections, these can all be regulated by law, but there has to be basically political will that is going to be created, I believe, I think it's going to come very quickly by the masses. I think this whole edifice is tumbling down. And while I agree with you, Josh, up to a point that, yes, I mean, I remember in the 70s when I was newly married and worried about nuclear war happening and wondering if I should throw in my hat and not go to law school and not study. This isn't, I don't think this time it's more of the same. Because of that quote that Payam read. I mean, it really, now, are we there now or will we be here 10 years from now? It's honestly 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Anyway, it was about chaos, universal convulsion allied with universal chaos. And, you know, Baha'u'llah says that soon the world order will be rolled up and new one spread out in its stead, that humanity has been given a reprieve. And when the hour comes, there will occur that which we can't even imagine. Shoukh Effendi talks about that too. after the Second World War. He says this was just the latest in a series of universal convulsions, and there will be ones even worse than this. So, I mean, you can take your imagination wherever it wants to go. And to me, it's a question of, is it going to be in the next 5 years, or is it going to be the next 20 years? But given everything else that's happening, like climate change, I see this as a shortening time frame. This is not to scare us. This is to say we have to act now, right? Because another promise we have been given in the writings is that we will not destroy ourselves completely. That is actually a promise in the Baha'i writings that I think sometimes we forget. We may still do a lot of damage and destroy a good segment of the human race, but that depends on our free will choice. So understanding that these twin processes go hand in hand and are necessary to the birthing process of a new way of being and a new order, I think gives me hope, because this isn't just randomly horrible things happening to us and we don't know why, and we don't know if it's going to end well or end badly. The final thing is really the statement of Shoghi Effendi, in which he says, while the immediate future is dark, incredibly dark, the distant future is immeasurably glorious. I paraphrased it, so I couldn't pull the exact words out. So again, it's a similar thing. The hope there is deeply injected.
So may I suggest, as a way of reconciling, or not reconciling, but bringing together our last set of comments in the sense that we invite the IEF to reconvene this particular conference and this particular topic every 5 years from now for the next 30 years, and we'll see how we're doing. Can we have agreement on that as a parting,
Sure.
suggestion?
Just not
Don't give
another
it too
COP
long.
routine.
So, friends, I think we're probably coming to the end of our time just now. It's been an amazing discussion among people who have such expertise, such insight, and such experience, which we really do need to draw on for these kinds of seminars, which has been absolutely brilliant. Also been following the chat and the comments that have been made there. And this concept around hope. Arthur Dahl, I'll just do a little plug for his book on hope, which, is something that we have to hold on to, but we hold on to it with realism. It's because we know that there are steps we can take. We know that there are things we should and must do, and we have the capacity to do many of those. And because we have that, the hope doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the experience. And I have to say, it comes from panelists here today have given us not just hope, but also their knowledge, their expertise, and their hard work over many decades. And I'll include Arthur and all the other people who are involved in this, all the people who are not seen, but are on the chat and have come today. I noted there were 80 people here today, perhaps more than that when I wasn't looking. But everyone is working towards these goals. And because we are working towards them and we're doing things and we're taking the necessary steps, these things will come about. It may take us a while and it may be hard and we may suffer a lot. And of course, we know from the Baha'i teachings that those who suffer from the soil that's turned over and suffers produces the best fruit, best crops. So it may just be an analogy that we need to consider. So I'd like to thank each one of you individually. It's been really amazing. And I hope that people will be able to attend the other remaining seminars in this series. If you look back in the chats, you'll see the information there. You'll see where the different quotes come from. You'll see where the different ideas have come from, and also some more information about the next seminar. And also about IEF. Let me just end with that note. It's completely free. When I say free, I mean it doesn't cost you any money, but what it does cost you is your sharing ability to share your intelligence, your skills, your ideas, and your time with a group like this that's worldwide and needs every contribution of time and energy that it can receive. So I'll close there. Thank you to Laurent, who is so wonderful helping me out, and also to Christine, is another amazing scientist who's been helping today as well, but is also the secretary of the international environment. So we'll say goodbye and hope to see you at the next seminar. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.